Hi everyone, this week we'll be doing lesson 16. Forgive me for saying this incorrectly, but it's the Synod of Udemperur. Like always, we'll be splitting up the different sections into the paragraphs that are in your book. And then just a little heads up, this chapter is a little bit more about our church history and how we came about. Introduction. The first thing that we need to talk about is what a synod actually is. So, a synod is actually a council of the church. So, in the simplest of terms, it's somewhere that you have a meeting or an assembly with church personnel to make important decisions or create rules or regulations or just have decisions made about the church. So in this particular synod, the main outcome was to westernize the Malankara Church. So we'll get into that in a second. What's important to realize is that the Portuguese missionaries tried to bring the Malankara Catholic Church into the Western Church. So the Portuguese missionaries, those from Portugal, are under the Western Church. So they came to Kerala in order that we start following their rules and regulations. This particular meeting that they had, the synod, was held in 1599, and it is where the Portuguese were able to make these changes within our own church. Archdeacon Geevarghese. So during this particular time, there was a bishop named Mar Abraham in 1597 who was appointed as the ruler or head of the church at the time. He handed his power and his position over to Archdeacon Geevarghese. At this particular time, it's also the time that the Portuguese were coming over and inserting themselves and trying to have an intervention with our church as well. So upon the death of Mar Abraham, even though Archdeacon Geevarghese was handed over the power, the Portuguese were also present trying to make changes as well. So during that particular time, the people who followed Archdeacon Geevarghese gathered together, decided to safeguard the Syrian tradition, and accept only Syrian bishops, regardless of what the Portuguese were trying to do. Menaces in the Malankara Church. So this particular slide talks about the Portuguese bishop who came over to Kerala to try to influence the Malankara Church. His plan was to bring the Malankara Church under the authority of the Latin Church. So when we say European or Portuguese or Western, we're talking about the authority of the Latin Church. So when he came over, he was trying to remove the Syriac traditions from the Malankara liturgy and introduce the Latin style of liturgy. During his time in Kerala, he aligned with the ruling king and local leaders to lean his way. He visited the churches of the Malankara, around the Malankara Church. He administered sacraments and he ordained many priests. He brought about many suggestions, ignoring the oppositions of Archdeacon Geevarghese. So, eventually, the archdeacon was forced to accept many instructions of Bishop Menaces due to the pressures from the king and other local political leaders. So because of that, even though Archdeacon Geevarghese had a following of his own, he was forced to make these changes since Bishop Menaces had such an influence in Kerala. The preparation for the synod. Bishop Menaces, the Portuguese bishop, decided to hold a synod, a conference or meeting like we discussed, with Archdeacon Geevarghese and many other priests and laypersons. His goal, like we mentioned earlier, was to bring Syrian Christians under the control of Rome and persuade them to accept the dominance or leader of the bishop appointed by the Pope, and also to give up the Syriac traditions. He stated that those failing to attend the synod without giving a valid reason would have to face excommunication, meaning they would have to be gone from the church. The proceedings of the synod. This historic synod was held in Udayamperur on June 20th, 1599, with 153 priests and 600 lay representatives. It lasted a total of 7 days and ended on June 26th. According as Bishop Menaces desired, he got approved the things regarding the faith and sacraments. For example, he had suggestions that were related to baptism, Holy Communion, confession, and the last rites, which were all approved. In addition, the Malankara Church was divided into 75 parishes, and new vicars were appointed for each of these. Thus, the custom of appointing vicars was formally introduced in the Malankara Church. Bishop Menaces tried to get the approval for the synod from Rome, but he did not get it due to the lack of proper procedure and form. This synod, which diverted the very path of the Malankara Church, had far-reaching effects in the Church of Kerala. The events after the synod. Bishop Menaces removed the Syriac text from the churches and forced the Latin system through his power and authority. Father Francis Raz was a Jesuit priest who was the first Latin bishop appointed in the Malankara Church on December 20th, 1599. The Malankara Church was divided into 75 parishes, and new vicars were appointed for each parish, which was new and did not happen prior to the synod. And then later, the Malankara Diocese of Angalamali was brought under the authority of the Latin Diocese of Goa. The transformation of the Malankara Church after the synod is what we will be discussing on this particular slide. With the conduct of the synod, the Malankara Christians had to give up the teachings of Mar Thoma that they had been following since the origin of Christianity. Many Western customs and practices were made compulsory for the Malankara Church with the synod. Some of the changes include the following. We appointed Latin bishops instead of the Syrian bishops. Priestly celibacy was made compulsory. Seminaries were established to bring in new priests. In the liturgy, our calendar was replaced with a new Latin calendar. The rites giving importance to the saints were introduced. The sacraments of confirmation, baptism, and Holy Communion being received together was stopped. The observance of fasting and abstinence was modified to fit the Latin custom. So the key point here and the takeaway is to know that this particular synod brought about many, many changes to the Malankara Church. We were initially, as Malankara Christians, we were following the Syrian traditions and Syrian way with Syrian leadership. When the Portuguese missionaries came over, they came over with the Latin liturgy and a westernization. We have seen through all these changes that we discussed that the Western missionaries did not sufficiently understand the tradition and history of the Malankara Church. In this way, the whole church felt very uneasy. With that being said, it's important to realize the missionaries did this with good intention. They made these changes truly thinking that it was for the best. However, these changes and these renovations did create problems in the Malankara Church. Through this, hatred against the Portuguese missionaries strengthened in the members of the Malankara Church, and this led to a division that we will learn more about in the next following chapters. The end of lesson questions for this chapter include: what was the aim of the Synod of Urayamperur? And 2, what were the decisions and changes made at the Synod? We'll see you next week.